I walked into that village just after sunrise. The light was soft, the air was cold, and not a single person was there. Every door stood wide open. Breakfast sat on the tables, bread, bowls, cups still holding warmth. The fires inside the hearths hadn't gone cold yet. Animals wandered loose through the dirt roads, chickens pecking at nothing, a dog sleeping across a doorstep like he owned the place. Laundry moved gently on the lines. Children's toys were scattered exactly where small hands had left them. A wooden horse, a cloth doll with one button eye, and the silence. I cannot describe that silence to you. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that makes your whole body go still because something deep inside you knows it doesn't belong. An entire village gone. Not a single person anywhere. Here is what I want you to hold on to before I tell you everything. By the end of this story, you will understand that the greatest mystery was never where those people disappeared to. The greatest mystery was why they worked so carefully, so quietly, and so brilliantly to make sure that everyone, including me, believed they had vanished forever. To understand why I arrived at that silent village on that unforgettable morning, I need to take you back to who I was before any of this happened. My name is Sister Marguerite. I had lived inside our convent for 11 years by the time this story begins. My days were orderly and my faith was steady, and I will be honest with you, I loved the simplicity of that life deeply. I woke before dawn. I prayed. I worked in the garden. I organized supplies. And several times each month I drove a small wagon loaded with medicine, flour, dried goods, and candles into the mountain communities our convent served. These were people the outside world had mostly forgotten. Old farming families, small villages tucked into valleys so remote that a doctor's visit happened maybe once a year if they were fortunate. I knew those roads better than most people knew their own neighborhoods, and I took real pride in that. But I also had something my sisters sometimes teased me for, a consuming curiosity about abandoned places. Whenever my route passed a derelict farmhouse or a crumbling stone chapel, I slowed down. I always believed that every empty place contains a human story that hasn't finished being told yet. I couldn't explain that instinct. I just knew it was true, and that belief is exactly what saved me from dismissing what I found that morning as something I would never understand. The village was called Aldenmore. It sat in a high mountain valley, surrounded on three sides by dense pine forest, with a river running along the eastern edge and an old stone bridge at its center that generations of families had crossed their whole lives. There were perhaps 40 homes, a small church, a grain mill that had stopped operating years before, and a community well that still worked perfectly. The families there had farmed the same land for over 300 years. They kept to themselves mostly, but they had always welcomed me warmly. I had delivered supplies to Aldenmore 4 times before that morning. I knew the faces. I knew the names of the children. I knew the woman who kept herbs drying above her window, and the old man who always insisted on helping me unload the wagon even though his back had been bad for years. So when I arrived that morning and found everything silent and empty, my first thought was not supernatural. My first thought was, something has gone terribly wrong. Maybe illness, maybe a fire somewhere further up the mountain. Maybe everyone had gathered at the church for an emergency I hadn't been told about. I went to the church first. Empty. I checked every home, one by one. every single one untouched, unlocked, full of belongings, full of life, but empty of people. I stood in the middle of that road and I made myself slow down. I made myself look carefully instead of panicking because panic would not serve those families. And that's when I began to notice the clues. Small things, things that seemed meaningless at the time, but refused to leave my mind. The livestock hadn't been stolen, they had been released. There is a difference. Stolen animals show signs of struggle. Released animals wander but stay close to home because home is all they know. These animals were calm. Every gate had been opened deliberately and carefully. Inside the homes, I noticed something else. The valuable items, the silver pieces, the jewelry, the good tools were gone, quietly packed. But everyday items, the things that make a home look lived in, those had been left exactly in place, almost staged. The fires had been built up higher than normal before being left, as if someone wanted them to burn long enough to still feel warm when I arrived. I didn't understand that yet, but I stored it. Out behind the church, I found footprints. Dozens of them, all moving in the same direction north toward the forest. They weren't chaotic. They weren't running. They were organized, grouped, like a procession, and they had been made at night, I estimated, judging by the moisture pattern in the soil. Whatever had moved these people had moved them together, quietly and deliberately, in the dark. I went back into the church. I had always noticed that the old records room behind the altar was kept padlocked, and I had never thought much about it. But that morning, the padlock was gone. The door stood open slightly. Inside, I found filing cabinets emptied of most of their contents, but not all. In the back of the lowest drawer, tucked beneath old baptismal records, I found a water-damaged journal. The handwriting was old, almost impossible to read, but two phrases repeated throughout it, over and over. The water remembers, and when the mountain speaks, do not wait for permission. I took that journal and I drove to the nearest town, a 2-hour journey down the mountain, and I began asking questions. That is where my real investigation started, and that is also where I first encountered resistance. The local official I spoke with told me flatly that the people of Eldenmore had probably relocated voluntarily, and that mountain folk sometimes did that without notifying anyone. He said it with the particular confidence of someone who had not listened carefully to a single word I said. I left his office with nothing, but I was not finished. I found a retired land surveyor who had worked the mountain region decades before. When I described Alden Moor and mentioned the phrase "the water remembers," I watched his expression change. He pulled out an old survey map, rolled and dusty, and pointed to the river that ran along Aldenmoor's eastern edge. He told me that river fed from a reservoir system higher in the mountains, an old one, built before any living person could remember. He told me that in the original survey, the engineers had flagged the reservoir's retaining structure as unstable. They had submitted reports warning of potential catastrophic failure during specific weather conditions. Those reports had been received by the regional government office, and then they had been quietly filed away and ignored for decades. My hands were shaking by the time he finished. I drove back toward the mountain, but instead of returning to Aldenmore, I followed the northern trail the footprints had pointed toward. It took me most of a day, and deep in the forest, following old markers cut into tree trunks, markers I never would have noticed if I hadn't been looking, I found the emergency shelters. They were built into the hillside, hand-cut and reinforced with stone, hidden behind brush that had been managed carefully for years, maybe longer. They were stocked with food, medicine, blankets, clean water, tools, and documents. And inside the largest shelter, huddled together and frightened but alive, every single person from Aldenmore. I stood in that entrance and I started to cry. I am not ashamed to admit that. Their community elder, an elderly woman named Hessa, took my hands in hers and told me everything. 3 weeks before I arrived, two of the younger men had climbed higher into the mountains and discovered deep fissuring in the reservoir wall. They had also found in the foundation stones an inscription matching the coded language in that old church journal, a language their ancestors had used for one purpose only. Warning. Generations before, a smaller reservoir had failed catastrophically and taken dozens of lives. The survivors had rebuilt their community, but they had also built something invisible, a plan. A detailed, practiced, generational emergency evacuation protocol passed down quietly through families for over 200 years. Every adult in Aldenmore knew it. Their children learned pieces of it before they could write their own names. When the young men brought their findings back, the community didn't panic. They enacted the plan. They moved quietly and together at night to avoid triggering interference from officials who had already proven, through those buried survey reports, that they would not help. They staged the village to appear mysteriously abandoned because they knew that an obvious mass exodus would prompt authorities to intercept them, question them, potentially force vulnerable elderly members back while bureaucratic arguments played out. A mysterious disappearance would buy them time. Time was the one thing they needed most. 4 days after I found them, the reservoir wall failed. The flood that came through that valley destroyed most of Aldenmore's physical structures. If anyone had still been there, they would not have survived. What looked like an impossible disappearance, what I had walked into that quiet morning thinking was the strangest thing I had ever witnessed, was actually one of the most extraordinary acts of collective human courage and preparation I have ever encountered in my life. These were ordinary families, farmers, grandparents, children, people who had every reason to feel helpless and chose instead to trust one another in a plan their ancestors had sacrificed years to build. I helped document their story. I helped connect them with support for rebuilding further up the valley on safe ground. I stayed in contact with Hessa and her community for many years afterward, and I made sure their evacuation plan, their 200-year-old inheritance of quiet, stubborn, communal survival, was preserved properly and never forgotten again. I have thought about that morning for the rest of my life. The open doors, the warm fires, the doll with one button eye left in the road. What I once read as evidence of something impossible, I now understand as evidence of something far more remarkable. People who loved each other enough to plan for the worst, practice for it quietly across generations, and execute it with such calm precision that the entire outside world assumed a miracle or a catastrophe had taken place. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not supernatural at all. Sometimes they are just ordinary people in the darkest hours, choosing not to abandon one another, and refusing to let fear be the last thing they pass down. If you had walked into that village that morning, warm fires, empty roads, breakfast still on the table, what would your very first thought have been? Tell me honestly in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if the truth of what actually happened to those missing villagers completely changed what you expected, please share this story because it deserves to be remembered.